Hello and welcome to a new episode of Lowdown. Today I am delighted to be joined by Ryan Baldi, author of The Dream Factory, documenting behind the scenes of the English Youth Academy system. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan, I suppose where to begin, youth development being such a broad area, I'd imagine there were several iterations before settling on a final topic for this book. However, what encouraged you to write a book on this specific subject?
Just a general long-standing interest in youth football, in young players coming through. I think there's nothing quite like it for whatever team you support to see a young academy product coming through, given that connection, whether that's to a local to the location where they're based, or whether that's just to see the kind of hope and the exuberance of youth coming through, the fearlessness of a young player kind of coming into the senior game and taking on all comers. There's nothing quite like that. So I guess it all stems from a fascination with that and an interest in finding out how these young players are produced and what goes into that process. I think most people who keep a sort of cursory eye on youth football and the process of academy football understand that there are negatives and positives, and I don't think it's necessarily known in much depth. So that's what I was trying to do: provide the depth, provide the insight, and especially with so many, because it focuses extensively on English football. It was, the premise is basically to look at how this new generation of English players has been produced. So the likes of Foden, Trent, Alexander-Arnold, Rashford, who all feature really heavily in the book. How are they produced and at what cost? And what are the downsides to a system that sucks in 12,000 young people and spits most of them back out again?
And I suppose you mentioned the word there, depth. And if you're to take a broad introspective look at that youth system, often in football, the word football and the other uncritical thinking, they don't necessarily go hand in hand. I mean, were you slightly perplexed, if not a little bit surprised, a topic of such magnitude hasn't been covered in detail before?
There have been other books in the kind of realm. Michael Calvin did one called No Hunger in Paradise in 2017, which covers some similar themes to what are explored in my book. I think mine is a more sort of all-encompassing view of youth football as far as I can see it. Michael did a great job of looking at the very human element and the human cost, which is something I've gone into as well, and kind of just taken on the mantle from him and updated it a little bit from the insight I was able to glean. But I don't think there's been as much done on the kind of processes and the day-to-day work on the grass as what I was able to do. There was a book, again, a guy called Chris Green wrote a book called Every Boy's Dream, but that I think was in 2009 or 2010. So a lot has changed in the youth football world since then. Not least the introduction of the Elite Player Performance Plan, which is a set of rules and guidelines that govern youth football in England for the top four divisions, and that was a real sort of seismic change in 2012. So things are a lot different than they were back then. So I've kind of combined the two in essence to take that work of Every Boy's Dream to look at the processes and the regulations and things and how each club operates, mix it with what Michael Calvin did with No Hunger in Paradise, and then also kind of go further to add a lot of case studies and to look specifically at people like Trent Alexander-Arnold, like I said, Phil Foden, Marcus Rashford, and speak to the people who were front and centre to their developments, and I think I've managed to gain a level of access into the youth football world that is unprecedented. To go to all these academies, I spent the last couple of years visiting football academies from the very top end of the game all the way down to non-league and everything in between. So there's a real broad spectrum and a real kind of a broad approach to understanding the different ways that different clubs operate and how things like money affect how clubs are able to operate the youth systems, how different philosophies work in on a kind of day to day, in a real world way. So yeah, I think some things have been done on it. I don't know why the idea that I've come up with hasn't been done before. My initial any hesitancy I had towards it initially was a worry of whether I would be able to get the access I would need. And I think maybe that's perhaps, if anyone's tried it before, that might be where they've fallen down, or where people might have just assumed that you would fall down, because it's quite a closed off world. I think clubs are often quite secretive of what they do in their academies for fear of any kind of backlash and to expose. I don't know if they feel like there are any trade secrets, but what I found was that the people actually who have their, whose studs touch the turf, the coaches and the people doing the day-to-day work are quite proud of what they do and are really keen to kind of show it off. So in meeting those people, I found it's actually an incredibly open environment. So yeah, that's where I was really fortunate, and that I was able to get the access that I needed, and that's where the insight comes from the people who are living in that world on a daily basis.
Naturally, the book is a comprehensive study of basically the English Academy system, and I suppose where's best to begin by dissecting that English Academy system, and as you related to earlier on, the EPPP, for people that are unfamiliar, the Elite Player Performance Plan. I mean, what are the main differences between Category 1, 2 and 3 academies in the UK?
So, yeah, the Elite Player Performance Plan, like I said, it's the set of rules that govern English football. Every club under its auspices is audited regularly and given a grading based on their staffing levels, their facilities, the investment they plough into their academy. And yeah, there are pros and cons to each category level. So Category 1 is the highest. I think there are more each year because clubs apply. I think just this year, Burnley were one of the new ones. Their academy I visited, they were in the process of working towards their Category 1 when I visited them, and they achieved that. Crystal Palace was another one I visited who are now Category 1. I think Leeds were the other who got it this year. I think there were three. So
I think it was Leeds, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Leeds. Yeah. So I think there are around 20, just over 20, I think, Category 1 academies. The basic advantages of that are the prestige of it, to be lumped in with the likes of Man City and Man United and Chelsea, who are all ploughing a lot of money into their academies and to be considered on their level. You also get to bypass the 90-minute catchment rule when you're recruiting players aged 14 and up. So for every other academy, they can't recruit players under the age of 16 from further than a 90-minute radius, a 90-minute drives radius from their academy. It's the idea is to kind of keep it local and to not force these young children to have to travel an excessive amount to train. But if you're Category 1, I guess the feeling is that we shouldn't be denying these young people the opportunity to train at the very best facilities. So therefore, from 14 and up, Category 1 academies can recruit nationally. So that's one of the advantages. And yeah, it just means you're providing a level of funding which translates to a level of coaching and facilities that is the top of the top. But then we see clubs who are moving away from who are kind of willfully dropping down the categories and reducing their offering, or even moving out from under the auspices of EPPP altogether. Clubs like Brentford, who shut down their academy, now run a B team model. They just felt it wasn't cost effective. They were a Category 2 academy, and it was costing them around £2.5 million a year to run their academy. And they became exasperated at losing some of their best players to the big name clubs. The final straw that they cite was the loss of Josh Bowie to Man United and Giancarlo Poveda to Man City. And they claim to only have received around £30,000 in compensation for each of these top level young talents that they lost at sort of 16 years old or so. And they felt they were putting in so much investment and not getting the return because the system they felt was rigged against them. So they decided to do away with their academy altogether. They received a lot of criticism for that because it meant heartbreak for the 100 or more young people within their academy system. They were told, they've got nowhere to come anymore, and they were being released. But they would contest it in the long run. It's going to lead to less heartbreak because they're not bringing in hundreds of young people each year into their academy who, the vast majority of them then are let go at some point. Now what they do is they have one single B team and they recruit players sort of 16, 17, 18 years old, all of whom they believe have a real chance of making it into their first team. So that's a really interesting thing to look at in regards to the future of the academy system in this country, because some clubs now are following suit. Huddersfield, Birmingham City are reduced their offering. Bolton dropped all the way down from Category 1 to Category 4 as kind of cost-cutting measures. So clubs are starting to feel that it's not worth the investment, not worth the time and effort, essentially. But others are going the other way. Like we said, there are teams who are still trying to make Category 1 status and believe in the value of that. So, yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of a divide coming. There's a good handful of clubs now are stepping away from the system, or like we said, reducing their offering to become a lower category intentionally. So yeah, it would suggest that there's perhaps a middle ground, or that this system that's been in place now since 2012 might be ripe for a bit of an upheaval or an updating. So that's something to watch out for.
Skeptics, Ryan, would suggest to the system that just by and large, sheer consequence of the numbers, if you're a Category 1 or in fact 2 academy, it is nearly Ponzi scheme-like in terms of what you referred to earlier on, and Brentford getting something like £30,000 for a player like Ian Pavetta, who's gone on to shine for Leeds United and is an established Premier League player by this stage. One gripe of mine when it comes to youth development is that very few times do you see clubs tailor an individual development program towards their players. Very few times is it completely organic. It's more at the behest of a game model of somebody else's lived experience. I mean, isn't it quite telling that this perhaps is the exception and quite not often a rule when it comes to individual and player-led philosophies?
Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of clubs profess to, but I think how much they really adhere to it when it comes to it is another matter. It's something I think that is on the rise. I think it was quite a key feature of a couple of chapters in my book to look at these clubs who are attempting to take a very individual focused approach to their youth development. Liverpool were a big one. They've been doing it for a few years. They are very much about tailoring each individual's development plan, so much so that results are de-emphasized, that how the team gets on doesn't take precedence over how each young player is developing within their system. And I use Trent Alexander-Arnold as a case study in that respect, looking at how he was transformed into a right back, and how he was that was his development plan, how it was communicated to him, the feedback that was put in place, the feedback mechanisms, and speaking with the coaches, people like Michael Beale, people like Neil Critchley, who's Blackpool's manager now, who was a big key figure in Trent Alexander-Arnold's development, looking at the very kind of the micro of how they did it, and then the macro of the philosophy of how they look to apply that across the board. So Liverpool are one who profess an individual focus and really kind of live by it. United are another. There's a chapter in the book where I kind of juxtaposed Trent Alexander-Arnold's development with that of Marcus Rashford, who was doing a similar thing just 20 miles or so across the road at Carrington, in that he was transforming from a winger to a striker at the age of 16, and they held him back. That they could have pushed him on and played him in their under 23s when he was 16, 17, 18, as they do with some of their bigger prospects. Rashford had the talent to do that, but they saw a future for him as a striker and wanted to develop his finishing, and thought he's going to get more looks at goal by staying with our under 16s and playing with players his age. He's going to get more opportunities for that trial and error process of figuring out how to finish and how to deal with the pressure of being through on goal and carry the burden of scoring the goals for your team. If he was playing up at under 23s, he might be only sniffing at half chances for most of the games that he plays. So they took a conscious effort to kind of sacrifice the team ethic and the chances of getting a talented young boy into one of the bigger teams and boost the results of one of the bigger teams by keeping him back and working on his finishing and rounding out his skill set. So yeah, they're another one who profess an individual approach and deliver on it. But from what I heard, a lot of teams say they do it, but don't necessarily follow through. And it happens through the leagues too. Colchester, one of the clubs I visited, and they are really individual focused. I met with John D'Souza, who was their academy manager at the time. He's since been promoted to director of football or an equivalent role. And he was saying that he always thought he had an individual approach. Dating back to when he kind of made his name in youth football with Brentford as a young coach there. But then he said, I stopped and thought, hang on, I always play 4-3-3. I always play with the ball on the ground. I have a philosophy about how my teams play. How can I be individually focused if I have this rigid kind of belief in how football should be played? What if it's in the best interest of one of my defenders to go along every now and again, or for a goalkeeper to go along if he's going to be playing at a League Two level? Maybe it's better for him as an individual to go along every now and again. So I have to kind of look at myself and look at that and adapt. So that's something he did. He adapted and instituted a proper individual focus at Colchester, which bore results for them. They're a club who have a real strong connection with their academy, between their first team and their academy. They're targeted on how many academy players they get through in a very specific way. The chairman wants 50% of the players to be academy players, and he wants 50% of the minutes to be taken up by academy players. And they were very close to achieving both of those targets when I met with John. So yeah, it happens right through the leagues, this individual focus, and I think it is something that's growing. But like you said, with the sheer numbers, 12,000, just on the boys' side, there are around 12,000 boys in academies in the top 4 divisions at any one time. You just think, how can you really claim to cater to the individual if there are that many individuals? The sheer numbers would suggest that it's very difficult. So yeah, that's where the philosophy might differ from the reality in some respects.
Wow, it's pretty illuminating. Just getting back to what you earlier said about Liverpool de-emphasising the results. I think it's funny that you mentioned Neil Critchley, because I was about to say, having taken over at Blackpool earlier in the season, I know they ended the season in a high with promotion to the Championship. He exasperated Blackpool fans, didn't he, at the start, when he said he wasn't looking at the league table for the first 10, 15 games. And it makes me more curious, Ryan, about this concept of having cultural architects within your club, be it D'Souza, Colchester. You speak about Tony Whelan, Paul McGuinness at Manchester United, Alex Inglethorpe at Liverpool. How important is it to have these cultural architects at a club where they have this egoless leadership from afar, and it really is a culture of empowering the player? Best case possible we speak about is Marcus Rashford. You look at him, what United have created, a leader both on and off the pitch. How important is it to have these cultural architects within your environment?
I think it's huge within academies. I think it's something that, like we said, with the whole kind of philosophy of developing the individual, it's something that people use the word culture and throw it around as a kind of buzzword. And it's easier to kind of just throw out there than it is to actually implement and make real. And there are different schools of thought as to how real it is within a senior environment. But I think it is crucial more so in academies, because you're dealing with not just footballers, not professional sports people. You're dealing with children, and you have a responsibility to them as young people first and foremost, before you have a responsibility to them as footballers or potential future employees for your company, for example. So you have to have that kind of holistic approach to developing young people and not sacrificing their well-being, their futures for the sake of one or two talented young players who might make it in the end. So that is something you mentioned, guys like Tony Whelan and Paul McGuinness, both people I spoke to for the book. There's a whole chapter in the book called Raising a Rashford, which looks at this kind of this philosophy of developing young people before developing young footballers, which was really key at United and at other clubs. Paul McGuinness used the term guardians of the United spirit. That's what he refers to people like Tony Whelan as, people who put the interest of these young people first and foremost and really appreciate the responsibility they have, that they hold in their position as guardians of these young people. You know, they're dealing with the formative years of impressionable young people, and that shouldn't be lost for the sake of footballing development. And luckily, with United and with other clubs, it isn't. I wouldn't for a second claim that that's the case across the board, but Tony Whelan, as you mentioned, in particular, is a very impressive individual. He's someone who's kind of one of the key figures throughout my book. He's a guy who's vastly experienced. He was a young player at United himself in the 60s. He became only the second black player ever to play for United, and when he played in, albeit in a friendly, but so he's dealt with a lot coming through as a young player. Now he's in his late 60s himself. He's been in United's youth set up since the early 90s. So he's kind of an oracle of English youth football, and it's really heartening to see a guy with all his experience who isn't jaded towards the role and is still deeply reverent of his position. And the culture they try to implement of making sure the people they're dealing with, the young people they're entrusted to them rather, are well-rounded and are given the opportunity to learn about other cultures when they go on trips abroad. For example, I cited the examples in the book of how United would encourage their young players to kind of make a presentation to their hosts when they go and stay abroad for a tournament. They'll present pennants and signed shirts to hotel staff. They'll make sure their rooms are tidied. The club will put together little pamphlets to inform the children about the place they're visiting with short phrases and things like that. They'll go and visit a city centre. It won't just be, they won't just be travelling from one AstroTurf pitch to another. They'll have the football blinkers off and be able to see the world, because these young people are travelling the world from the ages of 9, 10, 11. So it's important that they're not doing so just to kick a ball around. That these experiences are enriching, because the people who are looking after them are acutely aware that only a small fraction are going to make a living from this game. So they don't want these years to be wasted years. They want them to be enriched by them. And that is something that you would hope is the case throughout football. It's probably not, but it certainly should be, and you would hope that it is increasingly so. But yeah, I met and interviewed a lot of good people who are consciously aware of things like that and their responsibility. Like I say, my hope is that attitude will pervade over the coming years as we become more aware of well-being and mental health. And I think we really need to start to recognise that if they're going to be bringing these young people into football in such vast numbers, which on a personal note, I don't think is necessary. And interestingly, a lot of the coaches I spoke to and a lot of the academy managers I spoke to don't think it's necessary to have such numbers. But the decision is not theirs. It's the machine that needs to be fed, and the clubs are feeding it. And as long as they're feeding it, then the people who are dealing with these young people, these young children, need to be aware of their responsibility to them.
Yeah, unfortunately, when you say the word machine, it does bring negative connotations, doesn't it? I mean, personally, working in an academy environment myself, I find the biggest grey area is the gap between reality and parents' expectations. I don't think necessarily that parents totally understand what molds these human beings, such as a Marcus Rashford or a Trent Alexander-Arnold. They just see the finished product, the footballer at the end of the day. With that being said, do you believe the parents, are they educated enough?
I think they're easily exploited too often. I think it's a sad fact that too many get swept up by seeing their kid with say, for example, the Chelsea crest on their tracksuit or whatever club you care to name. are too easily kind of believing of the dream that their boy or girl is going to go on to be a superstar. Maybe they're not as aware of the numbers and the probabilities as they should be. And I think that responsibility rests with the clubs to make them aware of that. You'd hope that most do, but I know for sure from people I spoke to and stories I relate in the book that isn't the case. There are a couple of chapters that in the book that focus on the process of release and the aftercare that the game offers to the children that are released from academies. One focuses on the slightly younger ages, and one focuses on the players who get a little bit closer to the dream and before it's kind of stripped away from them. And in one, I was able to reproduce word for word an email that a Category 1 Premier League team sent to the parents of a 7-year-old boy who'd been with them since the pre-academy level at the age of 4. They released him or kind of disinvited him to continue training with them after he'd recovered from breaking a leg while playing football, without any previous indication that he wasn't up to snuff, that he wasn't performing. And it was just very impersonal. It was one of these emails whereby you're supposed to kind of fill in the name of the recipient, and they just hadn't bothered to do that. So it was literally, dear parent guardian, yeah, your boy isn't invited anymore. We don't at this age, we don't give specific feedback, but here are a handful of things that most kids could do with improving on. And the parents of that same boy, they asked me not to name the club. He was actually training with 4 Premier League clubs at the time. He's still hopeful of kind of continuing with a couple of them. He didn't want to burn any bridges, so he didn't want to name the clubs. But the same club who released him after being with them for pretty much half his little life had at one point one of the scouts had gathered the parents together and said that 50% of the boys in our academy will go on to have careers in the game or something like that. It was basically a way of boasting about their credentials as one of the best academies around, and how they pretty much guarantee a career even for these 7-year-olds, that 50% of them will go on to achieve whatever in the game. And yeah, it was a way of kind of bigging themselves up, and it was completely disingenuous, and of course it's completely false. So yeah, it was just really taking these impressionable parents and selling them a lie, selling them a dream and a lie. And they get targeted as well by agents. I spoke to Mason Mount's dad for the book. I wanted to get the perspective of the parent of a really gifted individual who was targeted by a lot of clubs. He told me the story about how he was on an international trip with Mason. He'd been playing for one of the England youth teams in France, and Tony Mount and his wife were at a bar after the game, and an agent approached him and offered him £200,000 if he could get Mason to sign with him. He just battered him away. He said, "No, there's going to be a quid pro quo. That money will be my son's money that you're paying me with. Somewhere down the line, there's going to be a quid pro quo for that. So I'm not interested. I'm not here to sell my son, basically." But you hear horror stories about mortgages being paid off, or cars being bought, or jobs being given to parents as sweeteners from agents or clubs who try and sell a lifestyle. I spoke as well to Rhian Brewster's dad for the book, who of course now is at Sheffield United, but has previously been at Chelsea and Liverpool's academy. At the point at which Rhian was looking to leave Chelsea, or at least was exploring his options at 14, there was a lot of interest in him from other Premier League clubs. And again, his dad Ian didn't want to disclose who it was. He didn't want to throw anyone under the bus, but he said there was one club who kind of one of the coaches put his arm around him, showed him around the players' lounge, and showed him the lifestyle, and said, if your boy comes with us, this is your life. This is how things are going to be for you. You're going to be at the stadium on match days. You're going to be rubbing shoulders with all these players and things like that. And again, a more impressionable parent would fall for it hook, line, and sinker, you fear. And that's kind of the unscrupulous side of the game, where there's this arms race for talent. The clubs are also desperate, and the people around the game, the agents and the managers, are so desperate to get these players on side for just out of the faint notion that one of them will be a hit. and there are methods and inducements used that are aren't within the rules and much beside the rules of the game. They're completely unethical.
Yeah, I mean, one parent who certainly does his due diligence, as you spoke about Tony Mount, a guy who doesn't suffer fools gladly.
Mm.
I mean, you recalled in the book, or you spoke in the book about how Tony recalled the advice he gave to young Mason at a kitchen table, where he's very pragmatic over his chances of progression. Chelsea obviously did good to develop the player.
Yeah.
How crucial is it to get that support network right around the young player at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's really big because these are the formative years for the young person in their life, and then it's strange, isn't it? Because they're kind of on a career path from as early. Mason was at Chelsea from 6. You don't really get that in other industries where you're on this kind of predestined path, or at least you hope you are from such an early age. Faint dreams of wanting to be a fireman or an astronaut don't really have the same kind of they're not as tangible at that age as they are when you're going into Cobham every week to train. You're wearing the club's crest on your tracksuit, like we talked about. So it is important to have the support of people around you, be that your family, your friends, or people at the club, people advising you, because you need to keep your feet on the ground and be realistic. And that was something that, like you said, that moment in the book where there was a family meeting among the Mount family when Mason was 14. Because that's the point at which a 2-year contract with the club ends and you have the chance to explore other options, and there was interest. Tony met with other clubs. I don't know if Mason was with him, but they did field interest from 2 other clubs. He didn't want to name them again because they're rivals of Chelsea's. Essentially, they went and they met and they were presented, and the other clubs knew everything about Mason, had a path laid out for him, and he thought at the time players weren't getting through from Chelsea's academy. Chelsea had one of the best academies in the world for producing players and bringing talent through, but they just weren't getting through at Chelsea. They were getting careers elsewhere, essentially, at this point, because Mason was one of the first to really break it on a sustained level. And Tony presented it to Mason at a kitchen table in this family meeting in a very frank manner. Said, we love Chelsea. They've been great to us, but looking ahead of you, looking at the boys older than you, that we know how good they are, we know what they can do, but they're just not getting through. Is it time for us to look elsewhere? On this occasion, Mason was adamant. He's like, no, I'm going to be the one. I'm going to get through. And they stood by him. They stood by that decision. They weren't going to. What they did is present the facts to him, present viable alternatives, present other pathways, and say, it's your choice. This is a reality. We support you in what you want to do. And Mason decided to stick with where he was, and he was sure he was going to get through at Chelsea. And his faith in himself has been rewarded. But I think that's kind of that's kind of an ideal scenario for a young player, I guess, is someone who's always looking out for their best interests and being frank with them, but ultimately not making any decisions for them. So, yeah, and like you said, Tony has been around the game a long time. He's been a manager at non-league level. He knows the game, and he doesn't suffer fools, like you say. So yeah, somebody like that, I think, is probably important, whoever that might be in your life, whether that's, like I said, a coach or a parent or a friend. I think it's important for these impressionable young individuals to have such sort of support and common sense presented to them. And you'd hope it would be something that is there for all these children. But again, the numbers would suggest there's probably not. There are going to be some who are going to be easily led astray, which is a shame.
Yeah, and then I suppose zooming back out on the bigger picture, looking at clubs again, Ryan, you see there's more of a concerted focus on some of the bigger clubs perhaps to kind of break away from this traditional model of, oh, we've always done it this way and it's always worked. Case in point being Arsenal. You spoke in your book about their pioneering approach to mixed sex training. I mean, are there any other Category 1 academies challenging the status quo as much?
Perhaps not in such an overt way. I think others have followed suit, is what has happened when you were specifically relating to the mixed sex training. That's something that's very common now. Arsenal were just an early adopter of it. I spoke to James Honeyman, the girls' academy manager there, and he was quick to praise the work of people like Tessa Sanderson, who came before him in the role, who again were very sort of cognizant of of Arsenal's standing within women's football and their position as one of the bastions of women's football. And they were, they wanted to stay ahead of the game and stay and be a leader, and that's what they did. What they did with their mixed sex training and exposing their best young girls to training with the boys, not just as a way of developing skill, but as a way of developing acceptance, which I think is also really key. Because there's no reason why it shouldn't happen, and it's something. I went to Liverpool's academy and spent the evening with Julie Grundy, their women's academy manager, and she was saying, they were doing the same thing. Their young girls playing mixed leagues up until a certain age. I think they're allowed to play mixed football until they're 18 or maybe it's 16. I might not be getting that quite right, but so the opportunity is there for anyone to do that. And I think a lot of clubs are adopting that approach now. And yeah, in terms of other kind of thinking outside the box, pioneering approaches, I think we're seeing a lot of clubs now look to other sports. We've seen multi-sports programs being introduced again, as much as a kind of social element to because these kids are giving up so much of their free time. That there's a desire among some clubs to not see them give up their childhood. So I met with John Pepper, who was until just I think last week Burnley's academy manager, who's recently just announced he's going to be stepping down. He was talking about their multi-sports program. They do things like that, have judo classes for one term, or they do go. I don't know what it might be, in laser tag or something with each other, just encouraging a social element because they do give up so much of their time. And we're seeing that more and more. I think Fulham, I think, do something similar. I met with Hugh Jennings, their academy manager. I think the innovations now are around protection of the youth and the childhood of these young people. And it seems as well that the kind of drive towards the individual development model is something that a lot of teams are trying to push and do in their own way. So that those are the main areas in which I think I saw kind of clubs trying to break from the norm.
It's intriguing you speak about that multi-sports model, Ryan, because having researched Icelandic youth development for my research thesis, I believe 2 years ago now, having visited the country and spoke to all these academy managers, they believe concretely that their multi-sports approach for the likes of Alfred Finnbogs and Gylfi Sigurdsson, that golden generation that came through and appeared at the 2016 Euros, 2018 World Cup, was a huge factor behind their appearances there. But then, I mean, we've spoken about all the big academies, which is fair enough. But what are the smaller academies doing to bridge the gap? Arguably, are there perhaps times where having limited resources, in fact, counterintuitively helps the process? You speak about ample case studies in your book from Colchester United with the Sues, Kidderminster Town, what they're trying to get there, and then bringing La Masia to Shrewsbury, which I'm intrigued about.
Yeah, so no, there are things being done down the leagues. There's a chapter La Masia of the lower leagues. It was named that because I met with David Longwell, who is Shrewsbury's academy manager, and he kind of cut his teeth at Hibs, where he made Hibs St Mirren. He made St Mirren the third most successful youth academy in Scotland while he was there, behind, of course, the old firm Big Two, and he made them competitive with Rangers and Celtic despite such a financial disparity between the clubs. And he has always been a big admirer of Barcelona and the way, not just the way they play, but the way they develop their young players. He used to hand out photocopied pages of Johan Cruyff's autobiography to his staff and things like that. He would be looking at people like Iniesta and Xavi and how they were developed and using the same processes with people like John McGinn, who was one of his big success stories up at St Mirren. And he's bringing those philosophies now to Shrewsbury, that a kind of a very Barcelona-esque model of play, but also with a splash of the Red Bull philosophy, because he was academy manager at Red Bull, New York Red Bulls for a while as well. He worked with Jesse Marsh there, and they have quite a different approach. It's almost anathema in some ways, and that it's a lot of without the ball play, a lot of pressing. So he's taking bits of both and tried to implement that down the leagues at Shrewsbury and seeing how that can help them develop players. But when you go down the leagues, you also become very aware of the food chain. So, for example, one of the clubs I visited early on was Bury, who, of course, sadly are no longer in existence anymore. I visited them in their final months before they went under and met with their academy manager, Mark Litherland. And he explained to me how, they had a really good record of developing players and they had a good youth team. They were a Category 3 academy at the time. And it was really interesting. I used the juxtaposition in my book for the very opening chapter. I thought it was a good kind of table setter to explain how finances affect things in youth football. They until they went under were training at Man City's old training ground in Carrington. And the first thing I noticed when I pulled up onto the car park was that on the facade at the front of the building, you could see the outline of where Man City's old club crest was, and the faded club crest, and you can see the words Abu Dhabi where the signage had been removed, but the paint hadn't been painted over, and it just had the words Burnley Football Lou because the C and the B of club had fallen off and never been replaced. And they didn't have a pot to pee in. Essentially, he had a yearly recruitment budget of £5,000 to run a Category 3 academy, and he told me about how the grant that they would receive from the EFL, they never saw any of it because the owners were throwing it away for themselves essentially, and people weren't getting paid on time and things like that. So one of the really fascinating things that he laid out for me was that they kind of at the age of sort of 11 or 12 they start to look at who are their best prospects, and whereas most academies would earmark their best prospects for a future sort of professional development plan down the line and looking at how they can develop them to be ready for the first team. At Bury, it was how can we make them ready for sale. That was a sad reality of their existence. The academy was there to prop up the club. They made £2.5 million over the last 5 years there through player sales. They kind of made a speciality of developing ball playing centre halves. That became what they were known for. And he openly referred to the clubs above them, Championship and Premiership clubs, as Premier League clubs, as their customers. He called them. We call them our customers. We develop our kind of A-list prospects with sale in mind, so that they're fully aware that before the age of 16 these players are going to be off somewhere else, and then the next level, the next tier down, are the ones who are probably going to have a chance of making their first team down the line. So yeah, it was really interesting to note that the food chain within academy football is just as real as it is at the senior level. So while there are those who are trying to punch above their weight, like teams like Shrewsbury, you mentioned Kidderminster, who had a really interesting idea of integrating a university program alongside their academy and making the football club the kind of heart of the town and replacing the dying carpet industry that they used to be known for. There used to be 15,000 people employed in the carpet industry in Kidderminster, and now about 500. And the football club are looking to fill that gap by bringing a university on site and bringing with that the custom that it brings to the town, but also providing opportunities to the young people of the town. So they would, even if it's not playing football, if somebody wants to be an analyst, they can go and study to be an analyst and work alongside, present video packages to the academy and things like that, to give real tangible experience and provide opportunities that way. So that's how they were innovating. And we touched on Colchester as well and the things they were doing there. So there are those who are still trying to punch above their weight and think outside the box, but there are also those who are either shutting down their offering, like I mentioned, Bolton was one who'd gone from Category 1 to Category 4 in I think it was less than 2 years they did that. And interestingly, Mark Litherland, who was Bury's academy manager, who's now Bolton's academy manager, and clubs like Huddersfield, who are adopting a B team model like Brentford. I think even Birmingham are doing something similar now. It's fairly recently announced, even though just over a year ago they sold their greatest ever academy prospect for £25 million, but they don't deem it a viable operation by all accounts. Judging, that was the news I read a while ago. Anyway, I don't know whether they've pushed through with those plans. So yeah, it's interesting. Some are innovating, some are deeming it not worthwhile, or some are just using it to survive as another revenue stream.
It's an interesting thought, though, isn't it? In terms of you were a young player starting from the beginning. You used the example, Phil Foden at Man City, Dele at MK Dons, two players that have gone on to enjoy success of similar magnitudes, let's say, in their young careers today. Dele began at MK Dons. Not a Category 1 academy, but not the worst by all means, but lower down the pecking order, to a Phil Foden, who began at a Category 1 Man City in the heart of Manchester. I mean, what's to say one approach is better than the other?
Yeah, it's not. I was asked this question the other day as well, and I think it sounds like a cop-out answer, but it is on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on the individual. I think if you're this kind of destined superstar like Foden always seemed to be. I think he was always, and Sancho would have been probably there with him as well if he hadn't decided to leave. But he was the one they've always felt was going to be the one who to break through, because they needed that as well. It's all well and good having this academy that you pump all the money into, and it produces great levels of talent. But it's only going to be sustainable. You're only going to keep attracting players if that pathway starts to open up a little bit. And I think Foden has been the canary down the coal mine for a lot of people at Man City. So his success there is going to be a really big win for them on that side of things. But yeah, you mentioned the example of Dele Alli going, starting lower down the divisions and having a really wide open pathway. So he didn't have the exposure to the facilities and perhaps the elite of the elite level of coaching and the world and the top level talent around him to sharpen his tools. But what he did have was a really wide open pathway. He was playing first team men's football in the second and third tiers at 16 years of age, and I think that really showed in his game. By the time he got to Tottenham, he was ready for the rigors of men's football at the Premier League, and he had that confidence that he could cope. And that's something again that I spoke to John D'Souza at Colchester about. He was saying that what they can't offer. The reason I went to Colchester was they were at the time, and I think it is still the case, they were the lowest ranked Category 2 team in the league. So they were the lowest in terms of lowest down the divisions to have a Category 2 academy or higher. So what they could offer was they didn't have the facilities of the top London clubs that the people they're scouting might want to go to, but they have a much more open pathway. And while their kind of local rivals, people like Southend or Cambridge or teams like that, can offer a comparable pathway, they can't offer the same sort of facilities and level of coaching. So they're trying to find their niche there. They even opened a development centre equidistant between Colchester and London, so they can extend their catchment area that bit further and try to sweep up some of the London talent. They run a minibus daily for the players based in London who train with them. Because they're selling them on the ideal of having a pathway there that some of the London clubs that would have been competing with the same players can't quite offer.
I think, quite often on this podcast, I like to celebrate youth development, but having what we spoke about off camera before coming on here, Ryan, you have to give that kind of nuanced and that balanced argument. You can't always be altruistic, and you've mentioned words earlier on such as customers and machine at the lower level, which kind of brings out those negative connotations. But I'll take you back to a quote from the current England manager, Gareth Southgate, back in his playing days. "I love the game, but hate the industry." And I think that's fairly applicable to what's gone on in youth development, albeit at the lower levels. And I think a large part of that stems from fear. I mean, when you look at short-term pressures, everything validated in the senior game by 5 o'clock on a Saturday, that's distilled now right down to the younger ages, where you not only have players, but coaches and staff playing for their futures.
Yeah, it is. It's that kind of fear of missing out as well, which is driving the recruitment. This kind of mass levels. Like I said earlier, there are around 12,000 boys in academy football in the top 4 divisions at any one time. Almost to a man, to a person rather. There were female coaches too I spoke to. Almost all of them would agree that that's too many, that they don't need to be taking players on from the under 9 level. They'd be much happy to see their clubs adopt an approach like Bayern Munich have done recently, where I think it's up to 12, isn't it? I think they've stopped taking players. But at the same time, the reason that's unlikely over in England is because clubs don't enjoy the kind of monopoly that Bayern do in Germany, whereby they can quite happily say, okay, we're going to take this ethical, moral approach of not recruiting before the age of 12. We're going to let the kids be kids, knowing full well that if these top young talents, they might miss out and go to a Leverkusen or an Eintracht Frankfurt, whoever it might be, that down the line they can hoover them up at will anyway. They're going to get the best players down the line. It's not really going to affect that. That's their business model, and it's very successful for them. In England, the competition is much, much stiffer among the top clubs when it comes to recruiting the best talent. That's why they stockpile so young. And in the book, I talk about the prisoner's dilemma string of chaos of game theory, whereby it might be in the best interest of all these clubs to enter into an agreement where they say, okay, we're not going to recruit from 12 or under anymore, but it just takes one of them to renege and sweep up all the benefits of being able to stockpile the best under 12 talent and have them in house before all the other clubs. So nobody does it. So they all just keep going with what they're doing as it is, and until a proper regulation is brought in, then it's not going to change. It used to be the case that you couldn't formally sign players before the age of 14 to schoolboy forms. That changed in the late 90s with the Charter of Equality, which is something. There's a big historical element to one of the chapters where I look back at the Lilleshall School of Excellence parade on the National School. I interviewed Jamie Carragher and a few other people who were there, looked at how that kind of set the basis for the modern academy system, and how in the late 90s, Howard Wilkinson, when he was technical director of the FA, drew up, he was tasked with revamping the youth system in England, because for so long, schools football was the dominant force. The English schools FA was the main power in youth football in England for most of it, the first century of its existence. It was only in the 90s when with the Charter of Equality, Howard Wilkinson handed power back to the clubs and initiated the academy system as we know it today, that things changed. And instead of being allowed to only sign players to schoolboy forms from 14 years of age, it was stipulated that if you want to have an academy rather than a centre of excellence, you need to be running teams from under nines up and having these players signed onto your books, because he'd gone and looked at teams abroad, at nations abroad, looked at the likes of Barcelona and Ajax, Sao Paulo, or another club that he looked all over the world at what other countries were doing, who were at the time supposedly developing players at a better rate than England, and they were all taking them on younger. There's a whole theory about the golden ages of learning between, I think it's sort of 5 and 6 years of age, where children are believed to be sort of disposed best to picking up motor skills and learning techniques and things like that. So, learning football technique, they want them exposed to the best possible coaching at the earliest possible age. For fear that if you let them just play street football, then by the time they enter a professionalized environment at 14 or whatever, they'll be lacking in some basic skills. So that's why the age was reduced. But what that led to was a knock-on effect of well, I think it's in the high 80s now, the amount of teams who have academies. But if you say the 92 clubs, each running an age group from under nines upwards, that's how you end up with more than 10,000 children in the system, whereby at the very top level, opportunity has only reduced since that time, since the late 90s, with the influx of money into the Premier League and the desire and the need to buy ready-made players for first team, that the decreasing patience with managers, and the unwillingness to take risks and to have patience with the trial and error process that young players need. So there are fewer opportunities to get through, but there are more and more and more children in the system. So you're feeding them, a really kind of thin, disappearing dream to an increasing number of young people. So that's kind of how we've got to where we are, and how we reverse that, I don't really know, because like I said, at the moment there's the arms race for talent, unless all those who are driving that agree to take their foot off the pedal, it's not going to change. It'll only keep going the other way. Although you can't sign a player before they reach the under nines level, there are still pre-academies about where players are training with the clubs from 5 and 6 years old and getting used to being in that professionalized environment, which probably isn't too healthy.
It's very fascinating what you spoke about and trying to comprehend everything. But I suppose when you say how do we solve it, if you picture a bell curve, for me, if you were to invert that bell curve, you have the top percentile, your Manchester Uniteds, and let's say we have the lower categories such as your Colchesters and Kidderminsters. What about that big gap in the middle? I mean, you've discussed at length about what the likes of Brentford and Huddersfield Town have done, for example, Bolton scaling down their academies. Are we at a danger of this happening more and more and losing the true essence of what an academy model is in the UK?
Well, this is something I was thinking about just the other day when a similar question was put to me. It's funny because the teams who've now adopted this B team model are reliant on at least a kind of critical mass of other teams not following suit, because if they're only signing players at 16, 17 years of age, the players they're signing aren't players who've never had formal professional training before. They're players who have either dropped out of other academies or they've signed from other teams. So if everybody says, okay, well, we're not going to take players until they're 16 anymore, we just want a B team full of 12 to 15 players who we think have a real chance of making it in our first team, where do those players come from if everybody's doing that? Do you re-empower schools football? Do you, what is the solution to that? I don't know. So it's funny, there has to be some kind of middle ground at some point, because if you go too far the other way, then you end up producing no players. So while I certainly would agree that at the moment we're having far too many players at too young an age come into the system, and like I said, almost everyone I spoke to would agree with that. The models that are being proposed and being adopted by the few who are breaking away, I think, if you just as a thought exercise, would be unsustainable were they to be adopted wholesale across the whole country. So that can't be a solution for everybody. So there's got to be some sort of middle ground if we are going to say that the system needs to be looked at and to be changed. Then it has to be something else, some way of meeting in the middle, I think.
You spoke earlier on about the prisoner's dilemma. It's brought back thoughts of the European Super League. I mean, in Germany, we've seen one of the market leaders in Bayern Munich. Their academy system has changed now to where they house only over 12-year-olds. And indeed, other German clubs have followed. So the danger being in the UK, if one of the big Category 1 academies follow suit, do the others join them? It's very interesting. And I suppose just a few more questions to conclude, Ryan. Did you have any biases challenged by undertaking this research between what you thought you believed at the start to what you now believe publishing this book?
I don't think so. I guess what I was encouraged to learn was that just the sheer number of good people working within the system, within youth football, in these clubs, was probably something that surprised me. Because like we said, I think we discussed before we came on, there kind of seems to be the coverage of youth football is quite scant, and what there is of it is bipolar. It's either spin to look at how great these young players are being produced by the clubs, the kind of success stories that we see, that clubs are very happy for to be out there, or it's a very kind of negative side of things where you're looking at the attrition rates and the human cost, which is all absolutely true and is all something I've covered in great depth. And it was saddened to learn of so many personal stories of parents and players that I spoke to about the heartache they suffered. But there's rarely kind of a melding of the two together and seeing how they all fit into the same, to use the word machine again, they're all part of the same ecosystem. So that was essentially what I've tried to do, and that was to learn of the good work being done, not just in developing footballers, but in working with people. I found really encouraging. That probably did sort of test some biases of mine, I guess, going into it. But at the same time, I don't come away thinking that everything's rosy. I know it's just a few good people doing really good work, who are also kind of shackled by the system themselves, and sort of powerless to make any real change, and they're just kind of doing what they can and doing what they believe is right. They're still kind of fighting against the tide. So yeah, they're encouraging signs, but overall, I think I just come away knowing more than I did going into it, because like I've said, it's kind of a closed off world. It's not a world in which clubs are too willing to sort of throw and open their doors and show what they're doing, because I think maybe they're worried that what they're doing isn't always going to be to the taste of the general public.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, Ryan, this book is a forensic explanation of how England's current crop were produced. Would a European Championship or World Cup triumph make it all worthwhile? Or is it more of a fleeting experience than we care to admit for these group of players?
I think what it would do, it would vindicate some of the methodology in terms of the coaching practices. if you look at what Germany did at the turn of the millennium, to then create that generation of players who went on to win the World Cup, it was documented so brilliantly in Raphael Honigstein's book, Das Reboot. There are parallels between that book and my own in terms of looking at the changes that have been made over the years and how the English system has tried to learn from elsewhere and how it's evolved and how best practices have been updated and adopted to the point now where we are producing talent on a level comparable with any nation in the world at the moment. You know, you look at the players coming through, it's incredible. But I don't think it should be seen as if a World Cup or a European Championship is one that all is well and that alone would justify the sheer amount of heartbreak. I spoke to David Conn for the book, the Guardian journalist, who's done a lot of work on the ills of youth football and the system. And he said something that I found really rang true, in that if we're going to say that this system is one that takes in 12,000 young people and spits out quite unceremoniously 90+% of them, then it's not a dream factory, it's a crushing of dreams factory. That's what you deal in. You deal in heartache. The few make it through are incidental. What you do is take people in, and then they don't get to where they think they're going to get to. So more has got to be done to either slow the attrition rate and to reduce the numbers of people being cast away, or if not, or in conjunction with that, do more to support them through that process, both in terms of making them aware of the likelihood of that, and then when it does arrive, make sure it's not too much of a shock to a system, and make sure that everything that they could possibly need to get them, you know, so it doesn't break them, essentially, is put in place. And that's something that from my studies and from the people I spoke to, I think the game itself, the decision makers, the policy shapers, they think they're a lot closer to cracking that than they really are, based on what I've learned. I spoke to a few people who have kind of got some of the answers, who've off their own back been helping young footballers. There's a guy called Paul Mitchell, who was a young player at United in the 90s. He has a program now called Revive. He's a personal trainer now. So he works with young players from sort of 18 and up, released from clubs in the Northwest. So from United and City and Liverpool. And he gets them back on their feet because he's aware, because he went through it himself, of just how crushing the trial process can be once you release. So you get told you're not good enough by the club you've been playing for however long. Then if you want to stay in the game, it's trial after trial after trial. So one club's telling you you're not good enough. Now another club slightly below that is telling you you're not good enough. And before you know it, you're falling all the way out, and your confidence is crushed and your fitness isn't there because you weren't playing enough games in the first place, because you were, you know, on the outskirts of the team, on the fringes of the team. So he's put together a program of personal training, of counselling, and of football training that he feels really kind of helps equip players to bounce back if they want to, or to kind of help them transition away from the game. And he's approached governing bodies and individual clubs to try and gain some support and to try and kind of link up with them. And he's found nothing but closed doors, because they think they're doing it all in house. They think they're doing enough, or they think they're pretty close to doing enough. And there was another parent I spoke to of a younger boy who was released by Liverpool, who she came up with a program as well that helped the younger ages to deal with it and to continue their training, but also receive support from peers and from people who've been through it. And again, she's faced nothing but closed doors too. So I think, yeah, like I said, the game thinks it's a lot closer to cracking this problem than it is. And if it is going to be a crushing of dreams factory, as David Conn put it, then there needs to be a lot more of a sort of safety net, a lot more robust of a safety net to catch these people who are slipping through it at the moment.
I think football books come out every so often, Ryan, that challenge your deeply held beliefs and preconceived notions. I'm referring to Raphael Honigstein's Das Reboot, Michael Calvin's State of Play. Certainly think the Dream Factory by your good self is going to be one of them. When is it officially out, Ryan? Just to clarify.
It's out on the 5th of August, so just over a month from when we're recording now, but it is available for pre-order in all the usual places. And so I'm told pre-orders really help with visibility and things. So if it does sound like something you're interested in listening to this, and you are thinking of checking it out, please do so. And any pre-orders or once it's out, any orders are greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'd have to follow that up by saying it's a must read for all educators, coaches, players themselves. I certainly know I'll be rereading it now over the coming weeks. But Ryan, anyways, thank you for being so generous with your time. Really took a lot from this conversation, very illuminatory, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks for your kind words, and thanks for having me on. And I really enjoyed the chat.